It's Thursday, August 14th, and we are currently watching a track shift with Tropical Storm Erin, which would unfortunately push it closer to the United States. And this is Erin in its current state. We can actually notice quite a bit of deep convection at its center, so definitely an organizing and intensifying trend occurring right now, and also a increase in general size is also happening right now as well. So definitely some intensification is occurring right now as we speak. And with this current intensification trend, we could actually see Tropical Storm Erin reach hurricane strength as early tomorrow morning or even tonight. And from there, it will just continue to intensify into a major hurricane by even potentially this weekend. And then we'll also notice that the National Hurricane Center's track has left open the possibility of potentially a more westward track, which would push it more towards the US, as well as that fish storm solution out to the Atlantic, which we're definitely hoping for. And here are our European ensembles, and we can definitely see that somewhat alarming trend that's would push Erin quite a bit more towards the US. We have quite a bit more ensembles moving that way than we did in the past couple of days. Of course, we still have our large cluster going out towards the Atlantic, so that's still looking like the more probable thing that would occur, but definitely just a heads up to be weather aware pretty much anywhere on the east coast of the United States right now. And for a better illustration of our shift on our models, here is the European model run on Monday, and we can see that Tropical Storm Erin was expected to be quite a bit far off from the coast, not bringing any impacts to the United States at all in this model run. And comparing that to the latest model run, we can see that Tropical Storm Erin from the European model is actually almost making landfall in the Carolinas, but definitely bringing some tropical storm force impacts to this area. And we can see the same trend with the GFS model. On Monday, it had Erin making landfall in Bermuda. And then in the most recent run, it has also shifted quite a bit further west from that. So definitely a westward trend in quite a bit of our models right now. Now we are definitely still pretty far out. We're about a week out from now. So these changes in our track shouldn't be taken with extreme seriousness, but it's just a big reminder to pretty much anybody on the East Coast, especially in the Mid-Atlantic and Southeast, that this could definitely still happen. So just a reminder to be weather aware and keep up with the National Hurricane Center's official updates. And then on top of our tropical weather, we actually have a risk of some isolated severe weather today, specifically up here in the far northern central plains and also the northern plains. There is a slight risk out here in the far northern plains and parts of eastern North Dakota and northwestern Minnesota. Now, this is an extremely conditional risk of severe weather, and some weather models actually aren't even showing storms out here at this time. So we'll definitely talk about that in a minute. But first, if storms were to fire, we could potentially see some strong wind gusts in the 65 to 70 mile an hour range in our slight risk area, then just a conditional risk for 60 mile an hour gust in the rest of our marginal risk area. And also the conditional risk of potentially some fairly large hail in excess of 2 inches in diameter if we were to get storms also. And lastly, there would also be the conditional risk of a couple of weak spin-up tornadoes. So actually the conditional risk of all hazards of severe weather, depending on if storms do in fact fire out here in the northern plains. And then once again, we do actually have a decent risk of flash flooding across the United States today, specifically out here in the mid-Atlantic where North Carolina meets Virginia. In that slight risk, we could see potentially 2 to 4 inches of rain. Then in the rest of our marginal risk, one in the desert Southwest, one in the northern plains to far northern Midwest, and also one which stretches quite a bit further into the southeast and up through the Atlantic coast. We could see the conditional threat for 1 to 2 inches of rainfall in those areas. And once again, the hottest areas today are going to be Texas, Florida, and the lower southeast, specifically the lower Mississippi River Valley. In widespread areas across this region, we could see some mid 100s feels like temperatures. Other hot areas would be pretty much the entire Great Plains, which would be expected to see some mid to high 90s feels like temperatures. And then pretty much just along the rest of the Atlantic coast, there is also that conditional chance of seeing some mid to high 90s feels like temperatures as well. And then this is what the radar could look like as we go into today. And we can actually see not really any severe storms firing up on this specific model run. I do definitely think there would be the conditional chance for a lot of severe storms, as they do have a cold front behind them, some subnoctic forcing from a trough, but mainly this atmosphere is going to be extremely capped, so it's going to be really hard for convection to get going out here, but there definitely are the conditions in place for some strong severe weather if that were to occur. But this model run doesn't really see any storms firing up until further around nightfall, actually, when the low level jet would kick up in far northwestern Minnesota. And then this would bring that conditional threat for all hazards of severe weather when it does happen, but it would be relatively short lived and would likely end by pretty much the early night hours. And here are 500 millibar winds today, showing where our large scale forcing and some of our organizing shear will be. We do see that big trough digging in across the northern plains, but one of the culprits for why we might not see storms is this large area of southwesterly flow across our main risk area, which is actually going to hamper the lift in front of our cold front quite a bit. And then also that atmosphere is going to be extremely capped as well. But there is definitely some forcing and quite a bit of organizing shear if storms were to fire. It's just not looking extremely likely right now. I'd give it about a 50-50 chance of actually happening. And then other things to note would be our big ridge across the desert southwest and Four Corners states. These will help to bring some organizational shear to potentially a couple of storms initiated in the upper plains, so possibly some stronger storms with those. Then we also will see a high pressure system digging in the Gulf, also around the Gulf Coast of Florida. Now, this is actually one of the reasons why we're seeing an uptrend in heat in this region, and this also could play a extremely big role in the steering of currently Tropical Storm Erin. And then this also could bring the organizational shear for a couple of storms out here in the southeast, which is why I do think we could see a couple of strong storms out there today, not likely being severe though. And then this is our storm environment out in our northern plains risk area today with that conditional threat for all hazards of severe weather. But immediately we're going to notice why we're seeing not really any storm initiation on some of our model runs and why it's only about a 50-50 chance of seeing severe weather out there today. First and foremost, it's going to be a extremely capped atmosphere, which just means that it's going to be pretty hard for storms to get going. Secondly, we have an extreme amount of dry air aloft, which can increase the threat for some damaging gusts, but that's only if storms do form. But another thing with it is that it does make it quite a bit harder for storms to lift and grow upscale. So another reason why we might not see really any storms out there today. Then also our first 2 kilometers of the atmosphere are somewhat stable, and we have a bit of a warm nose at the first kilometer, also hampering some storm initiation and upscale growth. But other things for the storm environment itself, it's actually not going to be too bad. We have a pretty moist environment, 70 dew point, pretty good for that region, and also a fairly unstable environment, 4,000 Cape. It's actually pretty unstable for this region as well. Other things to note would be that we do have some pretty favorable shear numbers. Our low-level helicity and low-level shear would be supportive of possibly a weak spin-up tornado threat. Then also our organizing shear is going to be quite high, around 50 knots, which is why there is that conditional threat for some larger hail and also just organized storms in general if they can actually get going. Another reason for that conditional threat would be our Cape up here near our freezing level and also a very high mid-level lapse rate, around 9 Celsius decreasing per kilometer. And other things to note would be a low relative humidity and a extremely high downdraft Cape 1800, another reason why we could see some strong damaging gusts. Also with that dry air aloft if storms were to actually grow upscale. And then our last thing is that we do have a bit of curvature in our photograph in the lower levels, so potentially some spin-up tornado threat as well. But this would all depend on if storms do fire, and currently that is not looking super duper likely. So this is one of the days where it is extremely important to stay weather aware and just see what happens, because although the certainty of storms is pretty low, you definitely do want to be prepared if some severe weather does come your way up here in the northern plains today.